This is System Crash. I'm Paris Marks.
And I am Brian Merchant. This week on the show, Canada drops its digital services tax under pressure from Trump. The 10-year ban on state-level AI regulation is dead. And the backlash to generative AI just keeps growing.
We'll love to see it. Plus, Peter Thiel and his buddies are starting a new bank named after something else in Middle-earth. And people are using chatbots to text their friends. You can support the show by heading over to patreon.com/systemcrashpod, where you can sign up to get monthly bonus episodes, including one that just dropped, where we get into the new movie Mountainhead and what we think about it. Also, rate the show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Now, let's start with the big story, because this was obviously huge news up in Canada. I'm sure it even got some headlines down in the United States, Brian, because of how Donald Trump was involved in this. But, we have been talking about these digital service taxes for a while. These countries around the world are increasingly bringing them in, and they largely target American tech companies, though not exclusively, under the argument that they're not paying enough tax in these various different jurisdictions around the world. And there was this process that was slowly playing out at the OECD, where there was supposed to be this big agreement on, a global tax deal that was going to make sure that more of the revenue from these tech companies would be taxed where the revenue is generated rather than where they shift it later in order to take advantage of lower tax rates and things like that. But the United States has stood in the way of that deal coming into effect. And so as a result, you have more of these countries bringing in digital services taxes, Canada included. Canada's digital service tax was supposed to start in 2022, but kept being delayed by the government as they hoped that this OECD process would actually result in a global deal and not just countries doing one-off sorts of things. And it was finally supposed to take effect. Companies were finally going to have to pay their first kind of remittance of digital services tax on Monday. So on Friday, Donald Trump, I'm sure under pressure from all of these tech backers, sent out a tweet and said the trade negotiations with Canada are off until the digital services tax is dead. And then we had a few days of are they going to drop the tax? Are they not going to drop the tax? And last thing Sunday night, basically as late as you could get Sunday evening, the Canadian government puts out this release and is the digital services tax is being rescinded. We're resuming renegotiations with Trump in the morning, but these tech companies will not have to pay the digital services tax. And effectively, Trump won and the Canadian government caved. And it's a really bad look. It really suggests to Trump, I would say, that he can easily pressure the Canadian government in these trade negotiations now to get even more from them, because they've basically shown that they don't have many cards to play.
Yeah, I noticed it because you tweeted it out, but we are in the middle of a transformative a bill that that would further eat away at any semblance of a social safety net and just reroute our sort of economic picture to benefit elites and those. So and it's truly we got so many wild things to get to there. So yeah, I didn't see this, but when I did see it, I was just come on, Carney. They keep proving him right. Honestly, under no circumstances do you gotta hand it to Trump, but he has intuited that he can get away with this stuff. In the States, it was Colombia sort of rolling over and sort of, just sort of meeting all of Trump's terms. All the law firms that he sort of singled out are just playing ball with him, giving him pro bono services. ABC just agreed to pay a fine to settle a lawsuit that was clearly just totally egregious. And on the world stage...
Yeah, $16 million.
$16 million. They're just paying him. So they're just paying him. They're giving him his way. And he's showing that he can just sort of be a bully about things and get his way. Is just proving correct. And the world stage in these trade deals, even after all these ridiculous sort of tariffs that he proposed months ago that we've covered on this show, countries are still coming to the table with them and still going, okay, all right, well, what can we do here? And it's just oh my God, you don't have to roll over immediately. The Carney thing is interesting, and I want to hear you more about the politics of this move, because Carney is in office right now because people got so mad at his opposition being associated with Trump in any way, being associated with Elon and being associated with the right, and the fact that Trump's talking about turning Canada into America's hat or whatever was so offensive to Canadians that you'd think that his political capital derives from confronting Trump, not from like rolling over at the first sign after a tweet. Like,
Yeah.
what's going on here?
Oh, I think it's fair to say that a lot of people who, even supported Carney, some of them were proper supporters and other ones were like, as you're saying, we can't go with the conservatives because there's this risk of the conservative leader being like one of these kind of right-wing populists who would potentially agree with Trump. So we need to go with someone like Carney, to try to head off what might come of this, recognizing that, the Liberal Party is still a party of capital as well. When you look at, say, the Democratic Party in the United States, obviously they're distinct political forces, but, also have a lot of similarities there too.
Largely
Especially,
analogous, yeah.
yeah, in recent years. And so Carney, as you're saying, came to power, basically with the slogan of like elbows up, right? Which comes from hockey, is basically like, we're going to get in a fight with America, we're going to stick up for Canada. And then, kind of what people have been saying kind of jokingly is that as soon as he came to power, it was elbows back down again, right? Saying very positive things about Trump to try to get some negotiations started, saying that Canada would participate in the Golden Dome missile defense shield, even though Canada has long opposed being involved in these kind of missile defense projects going back decades with the United States, really overturning that, bringing in some legislation that is really kind of trampling over people's rights, both when we look at environmental rights and indigenous rights, but also along the border and sharing more information with the United States and potentially making it much more difficult basically for migrants and refugees who would be coming to Canada. Too similar to things that are happening in the United States for, a kind of prime minister who said he was going to be opposed to that. And so I think that this decision to rescind the digital services tax was kind of like there was this building up, and then seeing him cave on this was just like, I think it has disillusioned a lot of people to what this government actually is, or even woken them up to what this government actually is, right? In that it's a government that's there to serve capital. It's going to do, what it's going to do to try to keep business interests happy. And it's really desperate, even though it talks about distancing from the United States and things like that. It's really desperate to get a deal to reduce these tariffs on the Canadian economy because they do hurt at the end of the day. And it's kind of an admission that the cards that Canada has to play are relatively limited, which, I think is something that a lot of Canadians will not want to hear. And certainly, Mark Carney suggested that was not the case, but this is how it's playing out. And, if I could just add one more thing there, I think that if we're thinking about this through a tech angle, right, it's not just the digital services tax, but one of the things that we've really seen with Carney and with the Liberal government as it's currently kind of put together, how it's currently operating, is that they seem really determined to try to attract tech investment to Canada and AI investment in particular because of, how, much excitement there is about that, how much money there's being splashed out on AI projects still. And so there has been this move, yes, to get rid of the digital services tax, yes, to take away the increase in the capital gains tax that the tech people here were kind of up in arms about. A lot of talk about making it easier for tech companies and AI companies to invest here, making sure there's not going to be, kind of difficult regulatory processes on building data centers and things like that, increasing the investment for AI, making sure it's rolled out more in the military and the government, public sector more broadly. There's even talk now about AI legislation that was supposed to be passed is now going to be significantly watered down. The AI minister talked about addressing the copyright issue. We don't know if that means defending artists or kind of shafting them in service of the AI companies like we've seen attempts to do in the UK. And then the other piece of that is Canada had an online harms legislation that was working through the last parliament, which didn't get passed. And, the minister responsible for that said recently that bill is not going to return in the form it was in before. So again, another thing that is likely going to be watered down in order to appease the tech companies.
Yeah. And what's going to happen to things like the journalism bill? Has anyone talked about that? Like, is that now in danger too?
We haven't seen it like actively discussed by the government, but I think that, I've spoken to people who are involved in that, and they're certainly worried that the deal that's currently in place, of course, Meta has not participated in that and has banned news links on its platforms.
Which, sorry, I should have explained. Canada has a law that platforms that host news, Google and Facebook, I think primarily.
Those two companies are the ones that are covered by
those two that meet the criteria that's set out.
Exactly.
Yeah, so they have to pay, a fee So it was structured a lot like the law in Australia and the one that they tried to pass in California and that was
Yeah,
vetoed.
the idea was kind of like you have to pay a fee unless you negotiate something directly with, the news companies to get an opt out, right? And so Meta just said we're not doing it. We're banning news links on the platform, and that has contributed to a lot of misinformation, AI generated false information spreading on the platform. Kind of taking the form of news. And then Google, of course, did make a deal that runs for 5 years. That's $100 million a year going to journalists that is already being handed out and being distributed at the moment. But I've spoken to people who are involved with that who are skeptical that that deal is going to last for the full 5 years. And Google has been quite open about the fact that it will not be renewing that deal, that if it comes up to the 5 years, it has operated for that long, it will not be continuing it, right? And it will be fighting any attempt to extend it. So taking that off the table has not been discussed as far as I've heard, but there is concern about where it's going. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's just obviously, it's like the Gavin Newsom thing that we talked about briefly with California, and it seems like when Trump activated the National Guard in LA for this performative thing, Newsom remembered that opposing Trump is good politics, right?
Yeah.
Like people despise these policies and this bullying and the strongman. That it really does, I think, speak to the cravenness of the opposition, whether that's Democrats or the Liberal Party in Canada. And we just hopefully things like Mamdani winning will wake him up. But when I saw that, I was like, oh, Paris is going to have some thoughts on this.
And of course, first thing Monday, I had to write up those thoughts, right? Especially Sunday night, like I was sitting at home and I got this email from Al Jazeera being like, do you have comment on the fact that Canada rescinded the digital services tax? And I was like, what are they talking about? It's like late on a Sunday night. What are they emailing me about? And then I checked and I was like, oh, of course, they just rescinded it, because the payments are coming in Monday morning. And so I sent them back like a quick email, but I was like, okay, first thing Monday morning, I got to get this thing ready to go and get some thoughts out there because this is ridiculous.
I mean, it is yet another example also of the increasing enmeshment. Is enmeshment a word? I hope it's a word.
I don't think so, but
no, I'm going with
we know what it means.
The enmeshment, the
this is the English language. We can just make up
the
words,
entwinification,
right?
the bounded togetherness
Perfect.
of
I love it.
the glommed onto ability of Silicon Valley and the Trump administration and sort of the new tech right. Like I think that
and even beyond that, right? It's like, yeah, you can see the way that they have used the Trump administration to pressure these other governments very effectively. Like, we've talked about, and there have been broader discussions about whether the tech industry is really benefiting from the Trump administration in the way that they hoped. But then you can see, examples like what just happened with Canada, where they are using their relationship with Trump very effectively in order to try to pressure these kind of global legislative initiatives.
Well, that's what I mean. That's exactly what I mean. Like they can do that. Like they're in a position where they can just do that. They can, they have these channels, and it's also why we were very, very, very close, which we'll talk about in a second, to getting like a statewide AI ban on AI laws in the United States. Because they can so effectively sort of lobby for their interests, and they can, affect like decisions like this. Like I would like to see some more reporting on like what spurred Trump to take this on, because it isn't something that's unlike tariffs, which we know that he just loves. Taxing tech companies, he doesn't, despite this union, especially it's more with his like sort of flunkies in his administration, folks like Vance and people, than it is with him. He has no great love for the tech industry. So like, what are these channels? Where did this tweet like materialize from? Like, why does he see this as a venue for leverage specifically? It's interesting.
Yeah, who was whispering in his ear on Friday that led to this True Social post that then kind of kicked off this incident with Canada, yet another one. I think it's a great question, and I would love to know that. And I'm sure that
Sachs
maybe Vance is part of that. Exactly. Possibly Sachs. We know that he talks to Andreessen, apparently.
Andreessen's in the inner circle. He's always around. Does Sachs have like direct stake in digital service? Like, would he? Because this seems like more of something that would benefit the giants.
Yeah, I don't see it unless it's just like a general thing,
right.
Like, this is coming and they want to stop it. I think part of the reason that Canada's digital services tax has been particularly in the crosshairs is just because Canada is so close. There's a lot of kind of back and forth between the US and Canada. It's much more kind of visible than, say, a digital services tax over in Europe, where they're dealing with other issues. And I think that they could see that, the United States has leverage over a country like Canada, which has about, a ninth of the population of the United States, right? About as many people as California, slightly more than that, I believe. But I think for us, we've been talking a lot about how the UK Labour Party has really, kind of given in to the demands of the tech industry in a way that, we're obviously not comfortable with, and that has been really friendly to the AI industry. And I think what we saw in Canada was the Trudeau government was friendly with the tech industry, but they had a lot of issues with that government in the way that we hear kind of tech billionaires in the US complain about the Biden administration. And, the kind of Mark Carney government seems to be trying to rectify a lot of that and show that it can be very friendly to try to get more investment from the tech companies. And, I think it's a really worrying development when we think about how, these very powerful individuals, yes, in the United States, but also, kind of the tech class in Canada of its own, less powerful, less wealthy, but still influential in its own right, is able to shape these kinds of policies, in order to serve themselves and get benefits for them and their companies.
Yeah. Well, and let's talk about how they, you know, how they very nearly, pulled off what would be a truly radical headline grabbing, measure if it wasn't buried under all the other garbage that it is dwarfed by. Just the true sort of catastrophic sort of reshaping of American society we were talking about up at the top.
Can I set this up and then get your thoughts on what we actually saw happen here? Because basically, we're talking about this, 10-year proposed state level ban on AI regulations that was in, the big, beautiful bill, the budget bill that Trump is moving forward. More recently, we saw it move into the Senate where there were talks about reducing that down to a 5-year ban, but that was potentially still going to move forward until we finally had confirmation in the last few days that this was fully removed from the bill as it moves back to the House. What I'm wondering is what you make of how close the tech industry actually got to moving this forward and why it was, finally kind of ejected out of this bill seemingly at the last minute.
So yeah, just, a brief background. We've talked about it before on the show, but it was really this kind of unthinkable sort of left field proposal I mean, one way to think about this is just Silicon Valley in one of its more united fronts is basically sort of testing the limits of what it can get away with in, this newly sort of autocratic Trump administration with more appetite and more tolerance for pretty explicitly anti-democratic and pro-corporate policy. And so, yeah, they had gotten this 10-year ban, a moratorium on state-level AI regulation through the gates. It had actually passed the House of Representatives, surprisingly, given that there are some even, right-wing tech critics who, or tech critics, quote unquote, but who, don't like big tech and who this, was unseemly to.
Yeah, big caveats on those folks being tech critics.
Big caveats. But like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who was like, if I had known this was in there, I would have voted against it. I think this is fun space lasers or something, but first, you just voted and you didn't know it was in there. But anyways, so it makes it to the Senate. It starts hitting some hurdles. There is some minor Republican opposition, folks like Josh Hawley, who's, he's quite down with the, a lot of the authoritarian stuff. He's famously the guy that, I think who pumped his fist at the J6 uprising. But there was some opposition to the bill, and the biggest was coming from Marsha Blackburn. And this is really interesting because she is a senator of Tennessee, where Nashville is sort of the largest economic center.
Big for country music and things like that.
Country music, the country music artists and the country music industry is there too. And so country music artists had sort of agitated for protections from AI and their voice and image replication. And they got a bill passed, the Elvis Act, it's called, of course. These bills always have to have a cute tie-in to the, to the state or whatever it is that they're doing. But it's the ensuring
Someone
likeness.
actually sent me a proposal thing in Canada recently for a, proposed bill or legislation or whatever, and have one of these acronym names. And I was like, We don't do that. That's a US thing. Like, that's not a thing we do up here.
I don't think they let you have a bill anymore unless you've got an acronym. So like that's
It
like
seems like
somebody's
it.
job
It
in
feels
the
like they
US.
always have to be that way in the States now.
Anyways, this one is Ensuring Likeness, Voice, and Image Security Act. So she was worried that would, steamroll that effort, which was quite popular in her state.
Right, it would
Again,
kill the Elvis bill.
it would
Okay.
kill Elvis. It would kill Elvis on the toilet. And it
Well, we know he's still alive, right? He's not actually
right.
dead.
So Elvis
So,
lives
yeah.
on, and Elvis does live on. So yeah, she kind of pushed back. She reached some kind of a deal with Ted Cruz, Ted Cruz, I think also it bears sort of emphasizing is what the chief driving force, as far as I can tell, behind a lot of this. There are some other guys in the mix too. Guthrie I think the House Ways and Means was a big fan. He met with Eric Schmidt, and
Ted Cruz is an interesting character because like he sucks for so many reasons, but he was also like a big opponent of Elon Musk's plans to like gut NASA.
well, again, why? Why do you think that is? It's
because of local stuff in his like jurisdiction
exactly
or whatever.
right. Yeah, Houston is a huge, NASA's a huge employer
Right.
in Texas.
Yeah, because he wanted to shut down the whole facility there, I think.
Yeah, and anyways, yeah, Cruz is he's truly one of the very worst, and he's totally on board with this idea. I think there's a sense that he's not done with it, even though that he's suggested that the AI moratorium is an idea that he would like to even try as like a standalone bill. It seems unlikely that if it doesn't pass now, that it would pass when it needs a higher vote threshold. But I digress. Anyways, Blackburn and Cruz seem to work out a deal, and it seems to be headed for passage. But then, like hours before they're going to vote on this, apparently she gets an 11th hour call from none other than Steve Bannon, who is just like,
Oh, I love the twists and turns here. Okay.
I know, it's good. Yeah, so yeah, and again, like Steve Bannon is vaguely in this sort of like Josh Hawley, like there is as authoritarian and sort of united on many of the more obscene fronts that the GOP is. There is factionalism. Of course there's factionalism.
Yeah, I remember talking to Naomi Klein, and she was telling me about how, like, apparently he has, like, a transhumanism correspondent to, like, get the latest on what the tech people are talking about around transhumanism, because it's, like, a big threat to whatever project he is supposedly working. I don't know, like, but they have some interesting tech ideas, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, exactly. There's some that are very like Josh Hawley, like he remains very skeptical of big tech. For a while, you have to remember there was this big censorship push. There was this big big tech is anti-conservative. And big tech just basically opened up its coffers and started funneling money into the conservative project, which, surprise, alleviated a lot of those concerns in a lot of corners. But you still have folks like Bannon and like Hawley who are, have these sort of, anti-big tech tendencies. Marjorie Taylor Greene, even, which is, such a weird coalition, but it's there. And so Blackburn says that, okay, I'm not going to vote for this. And so she was the deciding vote. That's how thin of a margin it was. And she is out. Once she's out, it's clear it's not going to pass. Then everybody jumps ship, right, to save face. Because, my read here is that, like, this is such an undemocratic and anti-democratic measure that we're voting to ban lawmaking on the states when just last year, when, the abortion bill was coming through and the GOP's line was literally like, let's turn it over to the states. Like, the states are the laboratory of democracy. And so you have this case where we're saying like, no, we're throwing all that to the wind. We don't care. We'd rather throw in with the tech companies than democracy. So this amendment to remove it passes by 99-1. And so on its face, if you just look at the vote, it's just like, oh, this was a non-starter. But in reality, they got one vote away from passing a total 5-year ban on state level lawmaking around AI, which this bill is doing horrible things. It's giving $45 billion of annual budget to ICE, making it the largest federal law enforcement agency in the nation.
$45 billion.
$45 billion.
Wow.
And Yeah, I mean so it's gutting food assistance, it's gutting SNAP, it's putting work requirements and cuts
SNAP
onto
being the food stamps program.
formerly known as food stamps, food assistance to needy people. It's gutting Medicaid, putting work requirements on Medicaid. Our nonpartisan budget analysis office thinks that it will end up with 12 million people getting kicked off their health insurance in this country where, it's already, impossible for a lot of people to get health insurance. And then meanwhile, it's all to fund ICE and for tax cuts, to entrench tax cuts for the rich. It's literally one of the most naked just transfers of wealth that I think a lot of analysts have ever seen over here. So it's a five-alarm fire on a lot of fronts. So that's taken up a lot of this headspace, and especially at a time when ICE raids are so visible, and we're going to exponentially expand that. It seems clear what's coming. I don't think it's any mistake that the day after that this bill passed with the ICE provisions, that Trump goes down to a new sort of
Concentration camp.
yeah, concentration camp for all intents and purposes, alligator Alcatraz that they're building in Florida. It's really obscene. I worry that it's going to get lost in the shuffle. And that's why I wrote about this week in the newsletter, is because, what Silicon Valley's role in almost succeeding in getting this ban pushed through cannot be overstated. They had Meta, Google, OpenAI. They were lobbying for this. They've been building inroads. Eric Schmidt is out there. Mark Andreessen, David Sachs, who we already mentioned earlier, is in favor, and JD Vance, is also connective tissue to these projects, and then is sort of a conduit for a lot of the right-leaning Silicon Valley interests. And they pushed for this, and they have been, making explicit inroads to the Trump administration. We know about the millions of dollars in demonstrative donations to the inauguration fund, the meetings, the showing public support by going to Mar-a-Lago. As we said earlier, they're doing a lot to sort of assuage Trump world's anxieties about big tech doing anything to stand in their way again. And they got to a point where they were in a position to get this regulation, this ban on, the hottest tech product of the last 5 years, and get all the companies, which would have left them all but untouchable, right? No federal legislation or federal regulation is incoming, of course. They've made that clear. So the only real plausibility for any U.S.-based regulation was going to come from the states. And this was a direct effort. Left-wing commie rag Politico, wrote a story about how this was explicitly the goal, titled "How Big Tech is Trying to Shut Down California's AI Rules." That's what it's, Colorado has some AI law, has an AI law it doesn't like to. New York is in the mix, but really they're trying to shut down California.
It's such a big throwback to when the auto industry was trying to kill California's emissions rules under George W. Bush, I believe it was. Again, a very powerful, influential industry trying to make sure that a state was not going to pass these regulations when they had a favorable Republican government on the federal level that was going to force them to do things that they didn't want to do, and was kind of the whole reason that they tried to get this right-wing party into power. And now we just see the same thing kind of repeated several decades later with the AI companies trying to make sure that California in particular was not going to be able to pass stringent AI regulations that would then, very likely end up being adopted by other states and become the de facto national rules, right?
Right, exactly. California is a large enough market that becomes a central question, of course, that do we adopt California policy and just sort of, de facto treat that as how we're just going to do all of our products in the U.S. We're big enough and we have enough sway that, yeah, of course, that's what they don't want. But, sorry. It's a democracy. That is what you have to deal with.
We know the tech companies don't like democracy very much.
And that's what, of course, obviously, look, any corporate interest seeing a window that it can ban regulation, and is going to maybe try to take a swing at it. But we can't let Silicon Valley off the hook for trying. Sam Altman is out there talking about its products and AI as this big democratizing force, and it's going to empower people. And we may have to rewrite the social contract because it's so powerful. But yet nobody gets to write any of those rules except us. Is the very clear, very undeniable at this point. This is where they were willing to put their money. What they were willing to publicly do is to say, we are willing to shut down democracy. We are willing to exempt ourselves from the democratic process. We don't care how bad that looks. We were willing to try to punch a ticket to get us out of regulation, to get us out of adhering to the democratic process. We were willing to do that. We were willing to throw our lot in with the Trump administration, and nobody should let them forget that.
I completely agree with you. And, I don't think there's anything else I can really add on what you've been saying there, because I think that you've covered it really effectively. But I wanted to bring in two kind of related pieces to see what you think. The first of all being, there was this story in the Wall Street Journal last week that as soon as Elon Musk was kind of pushed out of the White House, Jeff Bezos was making a move in to try to kind of be the new Elon Musk, to be the new guy, in particular to get contracts for Blue Origin, as there was talk of looking for an alternative to SpaceX to try to buddy up to Trump, which I found really interesting because
did I miss that story? How did I miss this? That's so good.
Because it was also at the same time as people were talking about his big wedding taking over Venice, right? And how just egregious it was to basically see him do this, take over a whole city for his wedding, and how disgusting that was. But the reason I bring that up related to Elon Musk is obviously Elon Musk has now refashioned himself as this big opponent to the budget bill because it goes against the work that Doge was doing. And, he's talking about setting up an America party to run as an alternative to the Republicans to primary these people, or I guess, compete against them, not primary them, because that would be within the same party. Then Donald Trump, basically making a true social post being we're going after all this guy's subsidies. We're going to sick Doge on the kind of benefits that Elon Musk's companies get to reduce them and harm the companies. And we might even deport the guy. Who knows? I wonder what you make of all that story that has been happening around the budget bill as well.
I mean, look, like I said last week, you take what you can get. You love to see this infighting between two of the world's worst people. It is an interesting wrinkle. Elon Musk, his attention span is so shot that, I could him founding a political party.
But I guess I still think it's unlikely as well. But I feel like a year ago, we would have said about him starting a major PAC and flowing hundreds of millions of dollars into the campaigns and stuff. We'd have been he's never going to do that,
Yeah, no, he could. He absolutely could. Especially, I think what would need to happen is there would have to be somebody who he nominally trusted, or was it to sort of deputize the whole thing too. I mean, one of the most pathetic sort of side stories to all this is that every time he Musk tweets something like this, you see Andrew Yang in his comments going that's what I am trying to do,
Really?
Yeah. So Andrew Yang,
oh my God.
For those who don't remember, was a one-time Democratic presidential candidate running on basically the AI is going to take our jobs sort of platform, but
and we need a universal basic income.
But 8 years to, I think he ran in 2020. So, but he was a few years.
It wasn't even early. It was late. It was in between the two, because there was the mid 2010s AI moment where it was the AI is going to take all our jobs. We need the basic income. And then there's the renewed version of that starts up in, late 22, early 23. And he's sitting in the middle when that narrative is kind of not a major kind of driving thing anymore.
So, yeah, Andrew Yang ran for president in the 2020 election cycle. Actually, I met with him for a story for Vice, and I
remember
when he launched his.
There's even a part of your book where he shows up, and it's wait, what? What's Andrew Yang doing here?
I regret sort of not filling in some of the details more, because people are why are you so sympathetic to Andrew Yang? And it's not that I'm sympathetic. To me, he's this almost patronizing figure who wants to solve things by just throwing some scraps to the people who are thrown out, where the real concern is the damage that's going to be done to the economy. And if we get a UBI and, get people enough to eke out an existence on this very sort of like paternalistic approach to politics in general. Like he's a tech entrepreneur. Like that was his background, and that was kind of his shtick too, his gimmick when he would like go on the campaign trail. Like, I'm like the Democrats' business candidate, and he would talk about jobs and automation. And like you said, it was like between two periods of like where that was like a hot button issue, so it never really landed. But it was interesting enough, and he's like very Silicon Valley type guy. Like when I went. When I went and I interviewed him in his campaign office, there was nothing there. There was a chair and like one table and like his aides sitting, like kind of like standing in the empty corner. Like, granted, he had probably just started, but there was nothing there. And I remember he had like this big old salad. Then I like sat down and like, okay, like you ready to talk? And he's like, yeah. And he just like sat there and like ate the salad, like, and I would ask him a question and he would just like take 3 bites of this. I'm like, what is going on here? Like not answering my questions, but eating this salad. But he was very like unconcerned, very like tech bro vibe about it all. Anyways, I digress. Andrew Yang, since like flaming out of both the presidential election and then flaming out of the New York mayoral election, which that's a interesting timeline to consider. Like, what if Andrew Yang won the New York City mayor office instead of Eric Adams? Where are we now? His project has been a third party. It's like I think, is it Forward, FWD, the Forward Party?
Oh, right. Yeah. Well, I feel like the biggest thing about a third party is like, there are like the Green Party and the Libertarian Party and things like that, which, are basically non-entities for the most part. Like, they don't make much of a noticeable impact because the elections are so controlled by the Republican and Democratic parties. They kind of shape so much of how the election in the United States works. And so if you're really going to like try to challenge that, I think you would need a lot of money and like a lot of resources behind it. And so it's like, is the tech industry really going to get behind, a third party that is just basically like, we're doing our thing, this is the way the world should work? I'm still skeptical that enough of all of them would do that.
Well, especially because they've already won a lot of what they wanted. They've got Vance in there. Thiel has their ear. David Sachs, Andreessen, like
Zuckerberg, even to a certain degree.
Bezos, if he, like maybe he could crash through the door.
And Altman still has relationships there too,
Yeah.
Especially now that Musk is out, he probably has closer ties.
Like, honestly, like Musk has another way to look at what Musk is doing, I think, is to begin to sort of recalibrate a more centrist tack. Because obviously the news media that covers power have the memory of whatever that saying is about
a goldfish.
Yeah, obviously. And obviously, like the news media that covers power and business has the memory of a goldfish. So they, if he starts saying, oh, this is an overspending, like I'm against the Republicans now, we need a third way. It like makes it easier for business reporters to come back in and say like, oh, Elon Musk is returning to the center. And so that can also sort of help inspire confidence at his companies that have been really sort of tanked by his involvement with Trump.
Exactly. And we know there's a whole genre of story that's just like Elon Musk says with very little actual context associated with it,
Yeah. So that could be another facet of this. I do think he's been embarrassed. And I do think, like, honestly, like this was a big L for Musk. His whole involvement. He comes in, he says he's going to do Doge, which is really something that Russ Vought and a lot of the sort of Trump administration folks wanted to do anyways. He becomes like the avatar for that and the fall guy for everything that goes wrong with it. He gets the program going, then like annoys everybody. Like his brands tank. Like it's it couldn't happen to a worse person. But still, it's very funny to see Elon Musk is probably one of the the biggest losers that's come in contact with the Trump administration so far. And now like he made that like half-assed attempt to sort of make amends, and and Trump is now saying he's just gonna look into deporting him, cutting off his subsidies. Yeah, I don't know where it goes. Maybe he does fund some project. The more damage that he could do is just by sort of yelling on X. I think that has a material effect because like he has a lot of followers. X is also the conservative platform now, and so it does matter if it sort of creates a permission structure for other conservatives to disagree with Trump a little bit more and the GOP orthodoxy. So like it does have some potentially actually interesting impacts, but yeah, I don't know about a full political party. I mean, go for it. Great, do it. Yeah, start your balance the budget, political party, and have Andrew Yang be your campaign manager or something.
I know that we're very opposed to alligator Alcatraz, the concentration camp in the Everglades. But, maybe if we not use it for migrants and just stick Elon Musk in there, it would justify it, right? Just don't deport him because then he might come back to Canada. And I don't want to do that either.
You don't want to deal with him again?
No, but speaking of reputations, before we get to our final stories, I know we briefly wanted to talk about how, there are more stories coming out about, AI, people turning against AI, this wider backlash that we're seeing to the generative AI industry. I just speak to people anecdotally in my life who are not tech people, who are not very aware of the technical side of this and all the business dealings that we talk about. And when AI comes up, they're just like, AI is terrible. AI is destroying the world. This is the kind of stuff that I hear just encountering regular people in day-to-day life. But what do you make of these stories that we're increasingly seeing, whether it's this one that was in Wired recently or these other reports that suggest that, people that aren't trusting AI, that there's increasing business concerns about AI. What do you make of what we're seeing there?
Yeah. So yeah, Wired had this story that I spoke to Reese Rogers, very, very nice reporter. And what's interesting, Reese, I think, is their service reporter. So he explains what a technology is or a product. So he's not their tech critic guy, or they're let's cover the social impact of AI. And I think he had just seen enough of this backlash to companies like Duolingo and Klarna saying, we're going to go AI first and replace people. And we're going to go all in on this technology that automates humans and the human touch, and seeing the blowback. So it became almost like a product story, like a business story about what I call, I think, the ambient animosity. That's what somebody texted me and said that sounded like a Fugazi song title or something.
Are you quoting yourself?
I'm quoting myself, yeah, because I had forgotten that I said it, but I was like, that's pretty good.
Whoa, I was really brilliant in that moment.
Well said.
Everyone
well
needs
said.
to know
Let
this.
me see. Brian Merchant. Well said.
Yeah.
Well said. I mean, we all know that this has been there. This has been percolating. I think continuously for years now, since this boom began. And the fact that it hasn't gone away, that the companies haven't alleviated it, I think ties directly into what we were just talking about, the need to say well, we better ban the ability for people to pass laws or regulations around this, because maybe we're aware that people really do not like this stuff. Maybe we know that, we risk sort of getting some hostile lawmaking because a lot of people really don't care for our products and are worried about what it's doing to society. So let's cut that off at the head if we can. Let's prevent that from ever, materializing into any concrete sort of phenomenon or law that we have to abide by. Because I think it's been manifesting more concretely, right? So I wrote a story for The Atlantic a year ago about this new sort of trend where people were marking their companies and their products and their work as AI free. And you kind of see it around a little bit. There's the no AI kind of logo that you can slap on your stuff. If you're an artist or a company, has a disclaimer that's we refuse to use any AI in the making of this product, things like that. But now it has sort of really, I think, leveled up. The big news this week was that Cloudflare, the web hosting company, one of the biggest web hosting companies, announced that by default it will block AI bot crawlers. So the AI companies are constantly crawling the web and making copies and taking the text and the images and everything for use and training their AI models.
And it can end up being kind of using a lot of, what would you say, bandwidth or whatnot. That's probably the wrong word.
No.
But it uses a lot of...
It uses a lot of compute power. Yeah.
There were always crawlers going around, but they're much more intense and they crawl a lot more
frequently. They'll ping the
Exactly.
site over and over and over. And we talked about this with the archivists and the librarians who are dealing with some of their websites being, unusable. The argument that the Cloudflare guy was making was interesting because it was explicitly like, if we just let these AI companies constantly harvest content for free, then there's going to be no incentive for people to make websites and create their own content if they can't compete with all this automated generated output. So it was interesting to see him take that explicit tack.
Yeah. Well, we're also seeing those stories about how obviously news websites are being, kind of heavily crawled by these crawlers, but also at the same time, the AI tools, even Google is sending less and less traffic to news websites as a result, which increases the kind of compute pressure, a little bit at least from having all these crawlers constantly going to collect all this information. But then on the other side, sending fewer people who are going to be looking at ads, paying subscriptions, all that kind of stuff to the website. So you're kind of like being hit on both sides. And I'm sure that that's the case for many other websites, not just, news websites, right?
Yeah, exactly. Most of the web infrastructure is still hosted by, the tech giants that won't, like Amazon and AWS. And so it's not like this is going to be a big major sort of sea change, but it gives, again, it's an indication that there's a consumer alternative. It's an acknowledgement of those headwinds that, that Reese was writing about in Wired, and all these polls that continue to show that 2 years after, the saturation of AI, people remain more concerned about it than they are enthusiastic by like considerable margins. And that's, I think, what is so interesting. And obviously we're not the first to point this out, but like this is a technology that has been working overtime to like sell itself, sell its use cases, say like, hey, this is so useful and so powerful, and so you can't get left behind. You gotta use AI. And yet, like in practice, people are either like, I don't like this, I'm worried about this, or here's a narrow use case that it does work for, not, oh, this is like the best thing ever. And in fact, that's what something else I'm writing another article about right now, is that like by this point, take Google, for example, like the utility of Google was universal, right? After 2.5 years of its saturation, people did not have a lot of qualms about using Google search. It worked. They were satisfied with it, got the answers that they were looking for.
There were growing, issues, but in general, yeah.
Tons of issues, tons of stuff. But it wasn't like Google didn't have to mount a world historic campaign to convince everybody to use Google. Of course, there were very valid criticisms that we should have heeded more, but users found the utility in it, and it was adopted quite organically and rapidly, which again is not to say that AI hasn't been adopted rapidly in many corners. But when you look at sort of the attitudes of people who are using AI and how they feel about it, it's a lot more complex, and the industry is having to do a lot more heavy lifting to sort of, again, exhibit A, the AI moratorium that they just tried to ram through than in trends past, because it's a harder sell to a lot of people.
I think that's a good transition for us to get to our final stories, because I know the first one that you wanted to get to is, related to how people are using AI anyway. So how about you start us off with that?
Sure, yeah. Did somebody say final stories? Do you want me to bellow final stories into the microphone? Or
go for it. Do it. If you really want to.
I do. I do. No, I'm just kidding. So yeah, no, you're right. It was it is a story that I think really just cuts into what we were talking about for our final story. I still did it.
So there you did. Yeah, I knew you had to do it. Yeah.
You know.
All right, what's the story?
Yeah, The Guardian has a report titled, "Hey man, I'm so sorry for your loss. Should you use AI to text?" And it documents the obviously depressing trend of people sort of increasingly turning to ChatGPT for social situations. The title comes from a 32-year-old tech worker in Canada, who received news that his friend passed away, and instead of reaching out to him using his own words, he turns to an AI bot, Claude, to ask him how to relate. Of course, he's like, it kind of examines this role that's ChatGPT, and that the AI bots have increasingly taken on as Basically just sort of like mediating a human conversation and human experience, and automating the basic chatter that we engage in as humans, which to me is like a new. We've talked a lot about teachers, and talked a lot about AI in the classroom and AI in work, but this is like, who knows how prevalent this actually is. And and he interestingly talks about how he had to sort of tone it down and pretend like he's not using AI when he is, because he got called out for it among his friend groups. But just the fact that like this is something that we're having to contend with at all is pretty distressing, right? Like, I mean, this is an automation tool being used to mediate just organic human conversations and human experience. That seems pretty dire.
Yeah, it makes you think a lot about those recent kind of stories and research looking at like the cognitive impact of, over-reliance on these AI tools, these chatbots, and then also, kind of the mental health effects that can come from over-reliance as well. This seems like it's a bigger story that we're only going to be hearing more about. But, on the other side of that kind of AI story is, of course, what Meta has been doing recently, where it's splashing out hundreds of millions of dollars, it seems like, to try to basically grab
Billions.
top
Billions, yeah.
from basically grab like top AI talent from other tech companies, right, to try to bring it into Meta, as Mark Zuckerberg feels like he needs to dominate the AI game. And on the one hand, it feels like completely ridiculous to be seeing this, like yet another sign that there has to be a bubble about to burst here. But as well, it's like, how can one person be worth tens, if not $100 million to bring them into a company? Like, this makes absolutely no sense.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is a reflection of the level of bubble that we've reached with AI, right? Like, offering $100 million like signing bonuses to, yeah, like you said, a handful of top researchers, just to try to, compete with what OpenAI is doing, or be the first to, Mark Zuckerberg calls it super intelligence. This is the super intelligence team that he's poached. So I do feel like it's just like more reflection of how frothy this is getting, how tenuously so. The one silver lining I will say is that it has absolutely clearly driven Sam Altman quite insane. He's very angry about all this, and he can barely contain himself talking about how mad he is that they're poaching this. So that's nice to see.
Oh, I think he was already pretty insane.
Yeah, he's already kind of lost the plot. Who knows what he's doing? But yeah, it's good to see him like genuinely upset, because like honestly, like this could, I think it's friend of the show Ed Zitron pointed out, like this could seriously undermine like OpenAI. Like, as big as OpenAI is, it is all sort of raised capital, and capital that's been raised with specific targets that it needs to hit, or things it needs to do, like unwind its company structure so that it's a for-profit, not a nonprofit, all this stuff, yada yada. Meanwhile, Facebook just has like a bottomless well of money that it can just throw at people, and if it does succeed in sapping OpenAI's top talent, especially as like the company culture there has been already hollowed out by the lack of faith in Altman's leadership and all these other things, it could really sort of undermine OpenAI. And whatever, Facebook has the money to continue a wanton quest to develop AGI, which is so still ambiguous and may never manifest at all. But OpenAI doesn't have the same level of luxury.
Yeah. Do you want to take our next one?
Next up, so Microsoft is laying off about 9,000 employees in its latest round of cuts, as Jordan Novit, one of the two, reports at CNBC. This is like 4% of its global workforce across all different teams, but it's going to hit Xbox and the gaming department especially hard, and just shows that even in these AI boom times, or maybe especially in these AI boom times, the axe is still falling.
Yeah, it really stood out to me that, Microsoft is cutting all of these workers. This is 9,000. They cut thousands more earlier this
System
year.
crashes
Meanwhile, Satya Nadella, the CEO, got a $30 million raise in the 2024 fiscal year. So, he's doing just fine while everyone else gets kind of hollowed out to serve the broader business goals. It's
funny how that works.
Yeah, so gross. But our final story this week, which I think is a big one, and kind of a late breaking one that just came out last night as we're speaking. But Palmer Luckey, Joe Lonsdale, Peter Thiel, a bunch of these other folks are coming together to form a new bank. As you might remember, Silicon Valley Bank collapsed a few years ago, in part because of a bank run that, a lot of these tech folks participated in, and that Peter Thiel and Founders Fund, based on the reporting, seemed to have accelerated, and kind of pushed people to kind of withdraw their money out of, making a bad situation much worse and leading to this kind of collapse. Well, they are starting a new bank to kind of take the place of Silicon Valley Bank, unsurprisingly called Erebor, a reference to the mountain in The Lord of the Rings, in the common tongue known more as the Lonely Mountain, where Smaug the dragon keeps his hordes of, kind of gold and treasure and things like that. So, these folks are launching this new bank with a Middle-earth name. Great.
Number one, nerd.
Yeah.
Number two, is it feasible that they'll just run out of you got like the Silmarillion, you got all the Tolkien, like there's so many.
There's a lot of names in there, man. Like
I know, but at this rate, I feel like they could burn through them all. They could, like, all the good ones. Like, they don't want to, like, they're not going to name a startup after like Tom Bombadil.
Maybe.
Or
Who
maybe
knows?
they already did. Yeah. Bombadil Capital.
Yeah.
Oh,
That'll be the next one. We're hearing about it in a few weeks. Just because they're all System Crash listeners, and they'll just need to throw it in your face. It stood out to me, though, when I was reading this. I was like, man, Elon Musk has been talking so long about turning Twitter X into like a bank or a payments platform or whatever. And these guys are just going to start a bank, like they're just doing it instead of talking about it forever. But, I just think another kind of grim development in Silicon Valley from these tech billionaires that, of course, has to drag, one of my favorites, Lord of the Rings, into it once again.
Are you a fan of the mountain itself? Like, did you recognize the reference?
I love the mountain.
Did you recognize the reference immediately?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I don't know that I would have that one. I would have recognized a lot of them.
I'm a nerd. I'm a nerd.
I mean, this Lord of the Rings comes up more. Like, my science fiction fandom comes up a little bit less, but just, we want to talk about Ursula Le Guin or whatever. We can. I'll
they're not naming a ton of companies after Ursula Le Guin stuff for
dispossessed, dispossessed industries.
The Ansible.
Yeah.
There you go. Well, that's our show for this week. System Crash is hosted by Paris Marks and Brian Merchant. Production is by Robin Simon. Our theme music is Dystopia by our good friends in Yacht. Support the show on patreon.com/systemcrashpod to get a monthly bonus episode, including our most recent one on Mountainhead. Thanks for listening.
Bye.